Okay, part 2. Now we're going to do Winn Dixie. Move my chair a little closer. Okay, so we did chapter 1. We met Opal is the little girl, and she found this crazy dog, Winn Dixie, at the Winn Dixie because Winn Dixie had broken into the grocery store. So we're going to pick up at chapter 2. I can probably do a couple chapters today. This is one of my favorite books, so I think you'll like it. So chapter 2. That summer I found Winn Dixie was also the summer that me and the preacher moved to Naomi, Florida, so that he could be a new preacher in the Open Arms Baptist Church of Naomi. My daddy is a really good preacher and a nice man, but sometimes it's hard for me to think about him as my daddy because he spends so much time preaching or thinking about preaching or getting ready to be doing preaching. And so in my mind, I just think of him as the preacher. Before I was born, he was a missionary in India, and that's how I got my first name. But he still calls me by my second name, Opal, because it was my mother's name, and he loved her a lot. Anyways, while me and Winn Dixie walked home, I told him about how I got my name, and I told him how I had just moved to Naomi, and I told him all about the preacher and how he was a good man, even if he was too distracted with sermons and prayers and suffering people to go grocery shopping. But you know what I told Winn Dixie? You are a suffering dog, so maybe he will let me take you in right away. Maybe he'll let me keep you. Winn Dixie looked up at me and wagged his tail. He was kind of limping, like something was wrong with one of his legs. And I have to admit, he stunk bad. He was an ugly dog, but already I loved him with all my heart. When we got to the Friendly Corners trailer park, I told Winn Dixie that he would have to behave and have to be quiet because this is an adult-only trailer park, and the only reason that I got to live in it is because the preacher was a preacher, and I was a good, quiet kid. I was what the Friendly Corners trailer park manager, Mr. Alfred, called an exception. And I told Winn Dixie that he had to act like an exception too. Specifically, I told him that he could not get in any fights with Mr. Alfred's cats or Mrs. Detweller's little yappy Yorkie dog, Samuel. Winn Dixie looked up at me while I was talking to him. Like everything that I said, he understood. Sit, I told him when we got to the trailer, and he sat right down. He had very good manners. Stay here, I told him. I'll be right back. Now, the preacher was sitting in the living room, and he was working on a little fold-out table. He had papers spread all around him, and he was rubbing his nose, which made me think he was thinking hard. Daddy, I said. He said back. Daddy, you know how you always tell me that we should help those less fortunate than ourselves? He said, and he rubbed his nose and he looked away at his papers. Well, I said, I found a less fortunate at the grocery store. Is that right? He said. Yes, sir, I told him, and I stared at the preacher really hard. Sometimes he reminded me of a turtle hiding in his shell, in there thinking about things, never sticking his head out into the world. Daddy, I was wondering, could he stay here with us for a while? And finally, the preacher looked up at me. Opal, he said, what are you talking about? Well, I found a dog, I told him, and I want to keep him. No dogs, the preacher said. We've talked about this before. You do not need a dog. I know, I said. I know I don't need a dog, but this dog needs me. Look, I said, and I went to the trailer door and I hollered, Winn Dixie! And Winn Dixie's ears shot up in the air, and he grinned and he sneezed, and then he came limping up the steps and into the trailer park, and then he put his head right on the preacher's lap, right on top of his piles of paper. The preacher looked at Winn Dixie, and then he looked at his ribs, and then he looked at his matted up fur in all the places where he was bald, and the preacher's nose wrinkled up. Like I said, the dog smelled really bad. Now, Winn Dixie looked up at the preacher and he pulled back his lips, and then he showed the preacher all of his crooked yellow teeth, and he wagged his tail, and then he knocked some of the preacher's papers off the table, and then he sneezed, and then some more papers fluttered on the floor. What'd you call this dog? The preacher asked. Winn Dixie, I whispered. I was afraid to say anything too loud because I could see that Winn Dixie was having a good effect on the preacher. He was making him poke his head out of his shell. Well, said the preacher. He is a stray, if I've ever seen one. And he put down his pencil and then he scratched Winn Dixie behind the ears. And he is less fortunate, too. That's for sure. Are you looking for a home? The preacher asked real soft to Winn Dixie, and Winn Dixie wagged his tail. Well, said the preacher, I guess you found one. Chapter 3. Remember, this book has no pictures, so you got to create pictures in your mind. What do you think Winn Dixie looks like? What do you think Opal looks like? What do you think the trailer park looks like? So I started in on Winn Dixie right away, trying to clean him up. First, I gave him a bath, and I used the garden hose and some baby shampoo. He stood still for it, but I could tell he did not like it. He looked insulted the whole time. He didn't show me his teeth, and he did not wag his tail, not even once. After he was all washed and dried, I brushed him real good. I used my very own hairbrush, and I worked real hard at the knots and the patches of fur that were stuck together. He didn't mind being brushed, and he wiggled his back like it felt pretty good. The whole time I was working on him, I was talking to him, and he listened. I know how we are alike. I know him. I told him how we were alike. See, I said, you don't have any family, and neither do I. Well, I've got the preacher, of course, but I don't have a mama. I mean, I have one, but I don't know where she is. She left when I was 3 years old, and I can't even hardly remember her. And I bet you don't remember your mama much either. So we're kind of like orphans. Winn Dixie looked straight at me when I said that to him, like he was feeling relieved to finally have somebody who understood his situation. I nodded my head at him, and then I went on talking. I don't even have any friends, because I had to leave them all behind when we moved here from Watley. Watley is up in North Florida. Have you ever been to North Florida? Winn Dixie looked down at the ground like he was trying to remember hard if he ever had. You know what, I said? Ever since we moved here, I've been thinking about my mama extra, extra hard. More than I ever did when I was in Watley. Winn Dixie twitched his ears and raised his eyebrows. I think the preacher thinks about my mama all the time. He's still in love with her. I know it because I heard the ladies at the church in Watley talking about him. They said that he's hoping that one day she'll come back. But he doesn't tell me that. He won't talk to me about her at all. I want to know more about her, but I'm afraid that the preacher, he's going to get mad at me if I ask. So when Dixie looked at me hard, like he was going to try to say something. What, I said, and then he just stared at me. Well, I think I should make the preacher tell me about her. Winn Dixie looked at me so hard that all of a sudden he sneezed. I'll think about it, I said. When I was done working on Winn Dixie, he looked a whole lot better. He still had all those bald spots of fur that he didn't have, but they did clean up nice. He was all shiny and he was soft, but you could still see his ribs. But I intended to feed him up good, and I would take care of that. I couldn't do anything about his crooked yellow teeth because he got into a sneezing fit every time I started to use my toothbrush on him, and then I finally had to give up. But for the most part, he looked a whole lot better. And so I took him into the trailer, and then I showed him off to the preacher. Daddy, I said. He said. He was working on his sermon, and he kind of muttered to himself. Daddy, I wanted to show you the new Winn Dixie. The preacher put down his pencil, and then he rubbed his nose, and he finally looked up. Well, he said, smiling big at Winn Dixie. Well, now, don't you look handsome? Now, I'm going to stop for a second. Think about for a second, how did she brush Winn Dixie? With her own hairbrush. Do you think your mom would like that? Not only that, but she's brushing his teeth, and with her own toothbrush. Again, that's so gross. She's a funny girl. All right, and she doesn't have a mom who's going to yell at her. And Dad doesn't know because he's so busy with his sermon. All right, back to the book. So Winn Dixie smiled at the preacher, and he went over and then he put his head on the preacher's lap. He smells nice too, said the preacher. He rubbed Winn Dixie's head, and then he looked into his eyes. Daddy, I said real quick before I lost my nerve, I've been talking to Winn Dixie. Is that right? Said the preacher, and then he scratched Winn Dixie's head. I've been talking to him, and he agreed with me. that since I am 10 years old now, that you should tell me 10 things about my mama. Just 10 things, that's it. So the preacher stopped rubbing Winn Dixie's head and held real still. I could see that he was thinking about pulling his head back into his shell. One thing for each year that I have been alive, I told him. Please. Winn Dixie looked up at the preacher and kind of gave him a nudge on the nose, and the preacher sighed. He said to Winn Dixie, I should have guessed that you were going to be trouble. And then he looked at me. Come on, Opal, he said. Sit down. I'll tell you 10 things about your mama. Chapter 4. 1, said the preacher. We were sitting on the couch and Winn Dixie was sitting in between us. Now, Winn Dixie had already decided that he liked the couch a lot. Number 1, said the preacher, and Winn Dixie looked at him hard. Your mama was funny. She could make just about anybody laugh. Number 2, she had red hair and freckles. Just like me, I said. Just like you, the preacher nodded. Number 3, she liked to plant things. She had a talent for it. She could stick a tire in the ground and it could grow a car. Winn Dixie started chewing on his paw, and I tapped him on the head to make him stop. Number 4, said the preacher. She could run fast. If you were racing her, you couldn't let her get a head start because she would beat you for sure. I'm that way too, I said. Back home in Watley, I raced Liam Furlton and I beat him. And he said it wasn't fair because boys and girls shouldn't race each other to begin with. And I told him he was just a sore loser. The preacher nodded, and he was quiet for a minute. I'm ready for number 5, I told him. And number 5, she could not cook. She burned everything, including water. She had a hard time opening a can of beans, and she couldn't make head nor tails of a piece of meat. 6, the preacher rubbed his nose and he looked up at the ceiling. Winn Dixie looked up too. Number 6 is that your mama loved a story. She would sit and listen to stories all day long. She loved to be told a story. She especially liked funny ones. Stories always made her laugh. The preacher nodded his head like he was agreeing himself. What's number 7, I asked. Let's see. Well, she knew all of the stars and the constellations. She knew every planet in the nighttime sky. Every last one of them. She could name every single one of them. She could point them out. And she never got tired of looking up at them. Number 8, said the preacher with his eyes closed. She hated being a preacher's wife. She said she couldn't stand having all those ladies in the church judge her. They were always judging her what she was wearing, what she was cooking, and how she was singing. She said it made her feel like she was a bug under a microscope. Winn Dixie lay down on the couch and he put his nose on the preacher's lap and he put his tail in mine. Number 10, said the preacher. No, number 9, I said. Okay, number 9, said the preacher. She drank. She liked to drink beer and she liked to drink whiskey and wine. And sometimes she couldn't stop drinking. And that made me and your mama fight a lot. Number 10, he said, and he made a long sigh. Number 10. Number 10 is that your mama loved you, and she loved you very much. But she left us, I told him. She did. She did leave us. I could see that he was pulling his old turtle head back into his stupid turtle shell. She packed her bags and she did leave us, but she left one thing behind. Okay, I said, and I got off the couch. Winn Dixie hopped off too. Thank you. Thank you for telling me, I said. I went back into my room and I wrote down all the 10 things the preacher had told me. I wrote them down just the way he told me so that I would not forget them. And then I told them out loud to Winn Dixie until I had them memorized. I wanted to know those things, those 10 things, inside and out. That way, if my mama ever did come back, then I could recognize her. And I would be able to grab her and hold onto her tight, and I would not let her get away from me. And that's where I'm going to stop today. Tomorrow is chapter 5. But you can see this is a sweet story, and this little girl is missing her mama. But she did find a new friend in Winn Dixie, and you are going to love this story. So tomorrow we'll pick up on chapter number 5, and then we'll do some more of the Wild Robot. So that is it from my Treehouse Fort reading for the day. My boys are in the backyard and they're building a fence in the middle of jumping on the trampoline. So that's it for today. Hope you had a great day. Happy Tuesday, and talk to you later. Bye.